Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Ron. For those of you that listened to the last posting on what hypnosis is all about, gave a brief idea of what it's all about and how to use it and such. Today, I want to cover some of the things that I do in the area of regression therapy. What got me interested in this to begin with was a book that I read called You Were Born Again to Be Together. And it was all about reincarnation and that people come into this lifetime to be together, to work out things from previous lifetimes. And I didn't have much of a grip on what reincarnation was at the time, but I knew somehow that I was interested in it, and the book fascinated me, and I wanted to be hypnotized to see if I was in another lifetime with a girl that I was dating at the time, and couldn't find anybody to do it. I even called the author of the book, and he was in Arizona at the time. He was doing weekend conferences in the Northeast, the Midwest, and the Far West in California. And he said if I wanted to do something like that, I'd have to go to one of those to be regressed. But at the time, I couldn't see my way clear to going there. So I just languished for a few years. And in 1979, I got a flyer in the mail. There was a local hypnotist doing classes on how to be a hypnotist. So I signed up. My primary interest was to hypnotize people because I figured if I can't get hypnotized, maybe I could satisfy my curiosity of reincarnation by hypnotizing others and see if they've led other lifetimes. At the time, I was going to one of the local colleges for a degree in psychology, and I figured, well, a class in hypnosis could certainly help me in the field of psychology, so I took it, and I was just taken away with it. I was so enthralled that within a couple of weeks, I had cards made up. Not that I was any good at that point, don't get me wrong, but I was having people in my home one night a week, and we were discussing it, and I was doing some demonstrations with what it could do, and I was getting volunteers to do past life regression. Well, for years I called it past life regression. Most people would get turned off by it, especially in the medical field. So on my business cards, I changed from past life regression to just regression therapy, which it covers it all. And doctors were more apt to send their clients to me if they thought that the condition that they were dealing with was somewhere in their earlier past in this lifetime, not even hitting on a past life. And as a result, I had a lot more referrals. But my true love has been to go into the subconscious mind and explore the ideas of past lives. And I have remained not a skeptic. I myself personally, I believe in reincarnation. I don't try to push that on anyone. If they don't agree with it, that's fine. That's why I started using the idea of regression therapy rather than past life therapy, because again, people would be more apt to come to me, and then I don't trick them into going into a past life. If an individual has a problem that started somewhere early on in this lifetime, they will usually go to that point in time. We will explore it, and oftentimes whatever problem it was that brought them to me can be resolved doing that. But if it hadn't been resolved, if it tamed it down just a little bit, then I realized we didn't quite get the issue itself. So they'll come back in, we'll go back to that point in time that we were before. I'll suggest they go further back in time, and totally on their own, they'll wind up in a past life more often than not. Using the idea of the memory, not the memory that you and I deal with every day. We're talking about that memory that's buried. And one of the reasons why I don't like to use trance or refer to the area of the unconscious. Now, that's a viable term. You'll read that in many journals and many books, the unconscious mind. But again, I feel that maybe 1 in 100 people, they hear the word unconscious and they don't want to go into that state, be totally unconscious and at the whim of the hypnotist and in their control. So I use subconscious. Most people can relate to that, especially when it's been explained to them, how the subconscious mind works. The mind itself, I feel, is like an unwritten DVD that when we come into this lifetime, it's pretty much blank and is to be written upon for this lifetime's events. And we continue to write every single day. Not all the material that goes on that disc is important. Some of the stuff is thrown out, but much of the stuff sticks. And we dip into that constantly. That is what's called training. We might train for years in a certain profession. And then once you're good at it, you don't have to think about it. It just comes automatically. Why? Because it's all recorded at the subconscious level. Well, I feel that trauma is the same way. It will bury itself. It will protect itself, especially when the trauma brings up a tremendous amount of emotion. It will bury it deep and protect it, allowing no one to get into it, even the person themselves, because it's an unwritten code that it's too traumatic for them to get back into. But in that state of hypnosis, the individual is calm enough to usually go back to it within, sometimes the first session. It might take a few sessions, but eventually we get to that core issue. When that core issue is uncovered, it's amazing the behavior that the individual begins to exhibit. Completely different than before. They're no longer fearful. They no longer maintain the same mindset, and they begin to live life as it was meant to live, especially if the incident that took place was life-changing for them. And utilizing hypnosis, relaxing someone to the point where they will allow the traumatic material to come up. If I would ask a person while they're in that beta consciousness, that awakened state, to tell me about the trauma, most often they won't go there. Because again, it was way too life-changing for them in many cases. So they won't elaborate. If they do, they give me just a cursory thumbnail print of what took place. When they're relaxed and they feel comfortable with the hypnotist, the two greatest things that a hypnotist needs from the individual is trust and rapport. When that trust and rapport is established, that individual is more likely to be able to go into that state quite easily and gradually go back in time to uncover those issues that are causing them problems in the present. It works so very well. Now, is it a cure-all? Is it one of those things that anybody can do? No, not necessarily. Most people, again, are afraid to use it. Most people go to psychologists, not the psychiatrist anymore. The psychiatrist anymore today is one that simply issues medication. But it's the psychologists and the counselors today that deal with the individual on an emotional and mental level. It's cognitive therapy for the most part. And cognitive therapy is not going to unleash what's there in the past that's so well protective. In most cases, it'll stay buried. The person's not going to activate it. But in that relaxed state, it's a wonderful thing that begins to happen. The person is relaxed, they're not as fearful, and they will allow themselves to go back. The hypnotist doesn't do anything more than suggest. If The hypnotist suggests that the person goes back to the point in time that would reveal insight into the incident. If the individual does not want to go back, they won't. But because they're relaxed, they trust the hypnotist, they've established rapport, they're more than likely to allow themselves to uncover those hidden aspects of themselves. And when they do, it begins to unfold. And it's fascinating. Sometimes the actual event itself, we just glass right over because it's not traumatic. But yet it was perceived that way by the mind at the time that it took place. And it buries it with fear. But when we get there, fear isn't there because it wasn't fearful at the time, at least enough to cause all the problems that it does. So we'll go back to the initial event, we uncover it, and nothing really takes place as far as any change in the individual. So that tells me that we haven't gone to the point in time where the actual event has traumatized the individual. In cases like that, we'll go back in time even further. Many, many years ago, I was on the board of directors for the largest organization dealing in past lives. And for 8 years, I was on the board of directors with them and came in contact with just so many wonderful individuals in this field. And we had an individual and his wife at the time that had written a book on prenatal communication and going back in time in the womb to uncover things that took place in the womb. I was fascinated with that aspect. We're going back into the mid-90s at that point. So I thought, well, let me see how that works. I came back from a conference that was out in California, and I put the techniques to use, and it was so fascinating. An individual going into the womb, and what takes place there is usually unlanguaged because the fetus is not capable of the language at that point, but they're capable of taking in the traumatic events that take place around them on an emotional level. And that can cause problems. I could tell you story on story that just, it's like one of those mystery novels that are page turners, as they say. But the idea is very valuable, it's viable, and it works tremendously well. Another area is called SRT, Spirit Release Therapy. And that's another subject that we'll get into at another time. But all of these I have put to really good use in so many cases where nothing else would work. These techniques worked wonderfully well. Well, I want you to digest what we've talked about. It's a lot of information and yet not a great deal of information, but hopefully enough to spark your interest, and possibly you'll leave some comments, and those comments will lead me to another session here on YouTube that I will address all of your questions, and we could go further and deeper into it. So for now, I bid adieu, and we'll see you the next time around.